This is Dr. Richard Semelka. So this presentation I'll entitle Dead People Don't Complain, and if you don't know you're a victim, you also don't complain. So what distinguishes between Paul Jakes, and just to quickly go over their names, George Tyndall at USC, what is his name? Heaps. It is, I have it here. Yes, James Heaps at UCLA. Now, George Tyndall was over $1 billion in settlement. James Heap, 700 million in settlement. Richard Strauss in Ohio State. Now there's a current documentary on him. He molested male students. Reginald Archibald, also male students. Robert Haddon at Columbia University. Again, another $1 billion settlement. And these were all for inappropriate touching. So the victims knew what was going on. Victims knew they were, they were awake. They saw him manipulating their private parts more than is probably appropriate. I think, again, the dark humor in Richard Strauss with male patients, some of them came in with a cough and he's massaging their testicles. So they knew that they were victims. Now, the thing about Paul Jakes' victims, Paul Jakes, the interventional radiologist at UNC, either they died, and I estimate maybe 50 would have. And the point is, UNC has a responsibility to find out what happened to him. This is the thing that is infuriating me about this, because I've been talking about this now. I sent them letters, and I verbally presented since 2014, you have to do something to compensate the victims. The fact that they're either dead and didn't know they were operated on by a drunk doctor, or they just simply were not aware that the doctor who performing these procedures on them was drunk. Because they didn't know it doesn't mean that you are not responsible. If anything, to me, it's much worse that you have not taken responsibility when the victims don't know that they were victimized. So that, to me, is a level of malignant misconduct, of cover-up, that is completely intolerable, and something has to be done about it. And certainly, I'm more than prepared to represent not only against these characters, but against other institutions as well. So the point is, just because victims are dead or victims don't know they were victims doesn't mean you're off scot-free. I think it's much worse. I think that what they've done is much worse. So one of the dark humor things about it is Carol Folt, who, again, I thought, that she said there's no retaliation. It was like Orwellian doublespeak. Suddenly, boom, the greatest retaliation, and this will be in another presentation which I'll call Royal Flush retaliation. She was part of the retaliation program, which you have to admit at some level is kind of dark humor. So she went from here, where basically it was all covered up. And in fact, I was fired without even any recognition of the victims, which is what and to this day still focused on, but any compensation myself for being fired, despite radiologists being highly paid physicians. And also I have been considered in the top 0.05% of all scholars, certainly in radiology, but of all fields, by an independent organization, Scholar GPS. So we're not talking about a random reporter, or even a very junior reporter, which Mary Willingham was as an instructor. That's the lowest level of the academic pyramid, and I was a tenured full professor for 18 years. So that's a whole other story as well. But the point is, because they were victims doesn't mean, and they didn't know it, doesn't mean that that you have no obligation to them. No, you have an obligation to them. And I'll finish on again, a somewhat humorous note, but it's a dark humor, is in a comedy bit by Neil Brennan. He describes that a female friend of his was saying that, to him, that rape is as bad as murder. And his response was, well, I know a number of women who were raped and they've recovered from it, but I don't know anybody who was murdered and have recovered from it. So this level of misconduct, and it's not clear to me why it's not apparent to more people other than myself, this level of misconduct far exceeds all these others. So for me, it's funny that Carol Folt is here, no victims, or no looking into any victims or compensation for victims, trying to find the victims, which is what I want them to do, to go back over the records, to speak to the technologists who are still, many of them, alive, who would know who some of the chief victims were, but no effort to do that. But instead, when Carol Folt, was fired here, I don't know, for some crazy thing with some statue, what is it, Slim something rather, Silent Sam. I was calling him, Slippery Sam, but Silent Sam, that's some craziness. She was fired because of it, but bobbed up, again, what she is now, as the president or whatever of USC, and then, bemoaning with the victims, you've been touched inappropriately, and giving out $1 billion of USC funds for victims who were maybe touched a little bit too long and with too much intensity by, who was it now there, George Tyndall. All those victims got $1 billion. Victims killed, victim permanently physically injured by a drunk Paul Jakes. Nobody compensated there. Then, of course, you have all the female doctors who themselves would be too frightened to speak up, who, and God knows what else happened, but were coerced into taking Al Parker's concealed weapons course in the basement of his house. Chair of Radiology knew that was happening. A head of legal, School of Medicine, who went on to be the head of legal, UNC, Chapel Hill, and that's why it was a problem for me. And the dean most likely had to know. I mean, these are things that are beyond the scope of the misconduct by all of these other people. And I'm demanding, and I'm not going to stop, I'm demanding something be done. And I do hope that major networks are watching these presentations and realize the significance of this. This is unmatched misconduct anywhere. And the thing that I've learned from human behavior over the years is quite often people do bad things because they simply can get away with it. So a lot of the bad things that happen in our world is because people can get away with it. Well, I think it's time that people like the senior administration at UNC, and even though a number of them are retired, it doesn't obviate the responsibility UNC has, like it didn't obviate the responsibility of Ohio State and Richard Strauss, or Columbia University and Dr. Reginald Archibald. They weren't obviated of responsibility because the perpetrators were retired and even dead by the time that compensation was meted out to the victims. These are the worst victims, the victims of Paul Jakes. This has to be addressed, and I will not stop until they get the appropriate recognition. This is misconduct beyond anything that has happened in the U.S. Thank you.